friends, welcome back to Dinner Church. We are continuing in our Mountaintop series looking at the Sermon on the Mount. Matt, Melinda, Dean, back again.
We are like
we're always in sync.
You're always so awkward.
That was almost in harmony.
It was.
Say it again.
We're starting a band. It just happened.
Side project.
You mean the two of us without Matt?
That's right,
Right,
yeah.
I'm used
okay.
to the
Creative differences.
I'm used to being kicked out. I want a solo career anyways.
Yeah, well, good luck to you.
You got it. Okay.
Back in.
Yeah.
So, I had a guy I worked with for a number of years, and we used to tease each other about each of us having an arch nemesis. We used that phrase.
Yeah.
And it wasn't someone who worked with us, but it was someone that we, a couple people that we both knew. And so there was this one person, and I would always say, that's your arch nemesis, and he had a different person for me. And we'd use it at different times. So if we were working on a project or something and he said, here's what I've got done, I would say, that's okay, but I'm pretty sure so-and-so would maybe do it a little bit better. Just kind of get under the skin. And it's not true. They weren't really an enemy, but it was just a fun way of jabbing and teasing each other. And this week, when Jesus is talking about enemies and how we view and respond to our enemies, I was thinking, so what does enemies look like for me today? And I was kind of drawing a bit blank until Dean and I were having a conversation a few days ago.
When you said Dean, I'm like, what?
Oh, except for Dean, he's my enemy.
Mortal.
No.
Mortal enemy.
No, but when Dean and I were talking and we said, it's probably more like someone who we disagree with politically, on social issues, those kinds of things probably become our enemies, and in a divided culture now, the way it seems to be trending, we only reinforce ourselves and our thinking with similar people. As soon as someone has a different position, it seems like we're no longer able to sit at the same table together. But that's not even an enemy, really. What Jesus is talking about is a whole other level.
Yes.
So let's get into this.
Oh, man.
This idea of loving your enemies.
Okay.
It's another one of those antithesis statements. You have heard it said. Ooh. But the kingdom, the Jesus ethic, but I tell you.
Right.
All right, let's jump in.
So I'll just say this quick as a story. So I grew up as a missionary kid in the Philippines and Singapore. My dad worked for the persecuted church.
Okay.
Which means the church where the country did not allow them freely to worship God.
Oh.
And so my dad, and actually us over the years, would smuggle Bibles into communist countries like China and the former Soviet Union to underground churches.
Oh, wow.
And the first time I ever heard the word persecution or loving your enemy and those who persecute you, my dad would come back from his trips and be weeping on the couch and saying, there are families and church leaders and communities who are being killed and thrown into jail because they love Jesus, because they want a Bible. And yet, before they go, while they're in prison, they pray for their enemy, the guards, the government, the man who killed his wife in front of him when he was put into jail, because the call here in Scripture says, love your enemies and those who persecute you.
Yeah.
And I remember as a young girl going, no way, there is no way it can't be. And yet it is. And what then happened was, as they prayed for those who persecuted them in prison, for those who gave so much pain and inflicted so much pain, I would hear pastors in prison saying, through my dad, we're in prison now because we're persecuted, but guess what? God is now giving us a whole new group of people to share Jesus with. They were always finding the goodness in those moments. But anyway, I say that because I would see it and I would hear these stories that it is possible for a human to actually love and pray
enemy.
a real enemy,
Yes.
the enemy of the state against you, and actually see that in a community. And that changed my life, I think, as a young girl, seeing that there are people that are actually living this out and how it has transformed the nation of China, Russia now, because of these people who are faithful and demonstrated this, to see then that influence on many lives changed. So it is, it's possible, and it sounds extreme, but there are many people even today still doing that.
Right.
Still loving their enemies and praying for those who persecute them.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah. Had to just say that because it was pretty an exciting time. And being a smuggler of Bibles.
It is pretty
Come
cool.
on.
Yeah.
I'll just say.
Yeah. And let's be honest, we've talked about the initial command, right? If I'm honest, sometimes even that one's just hard. Like
Yeah.
sometimes it's hard just to love your neighbor,
Just to love your neighbor.
That's true.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, sure, I can't think of anyone that I like actively hate. That's which maybe is a good thing, and that's a work that God has done in me, maybe. But like sometimes just stopping at the hey, love your neighbor, that can be like, oh, like it's because it's not just like tolerate, say hi to, be kind, you know, love them.
Yeah.
And if I'm honest, like how am I showing love to whether we think immediate like my next door neighbor, or the people in my community, right? Who is my neighbor kind of question, but like taken quite literally, how am I showing love to the people who live just next to me? And like even in that, I'm like, oh, I can be better. Like I could be better. I could do a better job of like going out of my way, not just to be kind and cordial and kind of like what's socially accepted, but to love them. So I love that even in that first, you have heard that it was said, like I personally am like, shoot, I'm still not getting that one right. Like
Yeah.
at least I know that
exactly.
I'm not
That's- yeah.
actively out there hating anyone.
Right.
But my goodness, like to say love your neighbor and your enemies and then pray for those who persecute you. Like that's a tall order for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's hard to pray for those who slam you publicly on your Facebook wall and not even send you a private message. And why I say that is, I think part of it, why this is difficult for me, I also think that we've become so polarized now. It is easy to keep the people that are your enemies far away from you and not even having to actively love and pray for. I mean, and I'll be honest with you. You know, I'm part of like a lot of women's groups across Canada where it's like find your tribe, find your like-minded people, go with the people that are like you, that will care for you, and that's important. But I think sometimes we've moved in that direction, that we've actually become quite insular, and we're actually not having opportunity or allowing ourselves to love our enemies and pray for those, because we've kind of kept ourselves pretty safe and
Right.
secure, because maybe we're afraid of the polarization, the dissension, you know, the chaos within politics and everything else. So this is an interesting one, because that means you need to be possibly out there or actively loving your enemies and praying for them.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like I think
Yeah.
this is a pause for me, I'll be honest.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. If we are to pray for those who persecute you, why does Jesus say that? So what about praying for those who persecute you? Why is that important? What does that do? So I've been like thinking on that a little bit. So how does that change me to pray for those who are persecuting me or who are my enemies? And then if I step back, I think when we consider that I've been shaped by this idea that the primary purpose of prayer is formation. So if that is true, if one of the primary purposes of prayer, let's just say that, let's be a little bit more open. If one of the primary purposes of prayer is transformation, then when Jesus says to us, pray for those who persecute you, and I do that, what I'm doing is I'm putting myself in a place where Jesus can transform my heart and my thinking by praying for those who are enemies, and it changes me in the process.
Yes.
So I'm submitting myself to this ethic of Jesus, even if I'm struggling with it, by praying for those, and I am being changed in the likeness of Jesus through that process. It doesn't guarantee that anything's going to change in that relationship of persecution, but what it does mean is that I'm a changed person. And so back to your story, I would imagine that those people have experienced the change that comes in relationship with Jesus and in deep intimacy with Jesus as they're transformed through prayer while they are praying.
You know, I was going to say this. Thank you for saying
Fascinating.
that,
Yeah.
because over and over we heard pastors who prayed for years, for the mean guard that physically hurt them and persecuted them, or the people that killed their family.
Right.
And I'm telling you, the stories aren't few but many. Restoration, reconciliation. The guard started receiving and knowing love for the first time and became then a follower of Jesus. They became longtime
Yeah.
friends, 50 years of friendship. Like, it does change you, and it can change a relationship where your enemy is no longer your enemy but can become friend. And I think that's the point of
Yeah.
this. And again, it's not all the time, but I think there's many times that it could happen if we actually did this, that
Yeah.
the enemy is not so far, but actually once we pray and have a different posture and understanding of love and how Jesus sees them, it changes everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've talked before in other episodes about how we're challenged to see the humanity of the other.
Yes.
And I think this is
Yeah,
happening
that's it.
here too, where even that challenge extends even to our enemies, right? People that we would see, or people who are against us, right? Because you might say, "Oh, I don't hate anyone, or I don't have any enemies," But then someone who is against you, you could be like, well, that's their problem. And automatically you've kind of like, there's that separation. I'm just not going to sort of unfollow, block, whatever. That's a them issue. That's not but like it extends even to them. And then that part in verse 45 where it talks about he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. It's like this level playing field.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's not a separation.
Right.
There's not a separation between good and bad and righteous and unrighteous. And yet we so often try to create a separation. And I think that's just the reminder that that's hidden in plain sight in this passage is to see like you have to view that person not as enemy but as person, as an image bearer of the divine. And that is challenging when we
it's
talk
hard.
about the dramatic types of situations you explained, but even just the person who's like human sandpaper to us and we just can't stand them for whatever reason, whether it's us or them or a mixture of both. But to see them as an image bearer of the divine that's something that reorients and shapes us in a way that is healthy and helpful, but challenging.
And I think too, as you say this, when it levels the playing field, the reason why there are levels for power and control and somewhat quote unquote safety, right? Like, I mean, there's a sense of we do that as separation for our own selves. But when you level the playing field, I love that. And it reminds me, I'm deeply convicted right now about that each person is an image bearer of God.
Yeah.
That's what essentially, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
Yes.
I love them. I'm asking you to pray. It might not, you're right, change the relationship, but it'll change you. It'll change you in how you see people and how you see people as God sees them as well.
Totally.
Yeah, one of the markers that makes followers of Jesus different from what Jesus is saying here is the people that we love. So like, it's easy to love those who love you.
Oh yeah.
It's easy to do this. Even the pagan does that. But this ethic of loving those who everyone else would say, like, there's no way you should do that. That then creates this gospel curiosity. Why on earth would you love? Why on earth would these people in jail view it as a positive thing? Why on earth? Like, all these things stir up, like, this is a different way. Jesus, it's not small. Jesus is, in all these episodes, Jesus is painting this vision of what life should look like or can look like. He's calling us into it. That is completely different from everything that we naturally would fall into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
radical. It's like,
It
it's not a
is.
small thing. These
No.
are huge things. And you can't be the same after this if you start living in this way.
Yeah.
And I would wonder if putting myself in the place of this, hearing this, so I know the base, I've heard, of course, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So I'm sitting there, I've heard that, I was taught that. And then he goes, oh, but I'm going to tell you to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. You can imagine the crowd,
Yeah.
like just going, what?
Yeah. I
Wait,
think he
wait,
just,
no, I think he just said something wrong.
Yeah.
I think he needs some food.
Yeah.
Give me
Yeah.
some more fish and bread. Like, something's going on. Because
I'm back to blessed are the cheesemakers. I want a life of Brian there for you. I like when he was just back there.
yeah, but then, you know what I mean? And so it's like, this is life-changing, upside down, counterculture, all the things, but even as it pertains today, it's huge. But it is something where, imagine the church is known for that kind of radical love. Imagine we as followers of Jesus are known versus for what we're against, for what we rally against, for who we don't let into the doors, who we don't associate ourselves with. But that would change everything.
Yeah.
And it's happening. There are people that are living this out. I've seen this.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But imagine if we all chose to do this as well.
Yeah, it's funny, even in hearing you say that, I'm reminded of a time when hearing people say something like, well, they're like against the gospel, or that person's like an enemy of the gospel. Like, therefore, my justification for keeping them outside or separate or not wanting to engage with them is like, I'm allowed because they're against it. They are, evil or bad. And it's like, okay, well, according to Jesus, I hate to break it to you,
Yeah.
but love them, pray for them. And again, in doing so, I think that it changes our heart posture.
Can we just ask thoughts on the last line?
Yes, I was
Yes.
just going to say,
Before we toss it to everybody.
be perfect.
Perfect.
Therefore, as your
What do you think? What do you wonder about that? What do we do with that?
Well, I nerded out a little bit.
Yeah,
Okay,
give it to
as,
us.
you go.
as I do. And it can be, it's not for sure, but it can be sometimes read as like, it's androcentric, male, masculine language, but it could mean like to be a man. And not in the sense that we sometimes hear it in toxic masculinity, like man up, be a man, but rather it's sort of the heart behind it is like to be fully formed,
To be mature.
reach maturity. So we see perfect and we're like, oh, that's a barrier. How am I ever supposed to be perfect, right?
Right.
But if you understand it in the context of like become fully formed in your understanding, in your approach, as God is
fully
It's fully formed. Yeah.
then it's like, oh, now it's
Now it
less
feels aspirational.
Right.
aspirational.
This, if you say perfect in the
That feels
context of
like a
we
defeat.
feel, it feels a defeat. You're
Like, I
like,
might as well
I'm
Yes.
done.
take my bat and go home or
Yeah.
whatever. the
Yeah, I've done
story
enough.
is. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I won't be
done.
perfect, therefore
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not. I will not be like
Why
my
try?
heavenly Father.
It's like, yeah, it's kind of like, it's like the gospel version of like adulting, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard work. You got to go in there and
Yeah.
do all this stuff that's like not necessarily fun, but it's like that's part of it. That's part of
Yeah.
maturity and growing up is like you do all this stuff that like we don't love doing, but it's like necessary and actually kind of fruitful. And you can sit back and be like, oh yeah, that was worth it.
Right.
I think in that sense, there is again that invitation to like move into those spaces of like becoming that. And really, who doesn't want to be, again, perfect is maybe a troublesome label and word for many of us. But like, who doesn't want to continue to grow into this like fully formed,
Yeah.
mature version where you feel like aligned in your purpose with becoming a follower of Jesus?
So then when Jesus says,
That's it.
I have come to give you life to the full,
Yes.
if that's
That's
where we're
it.
going with this, if we cross those together,
good.
life to the full looks like reaching your full version of maturity,
Yeah.
of
Yes.
which God is the perfect example
Right.
of that.
Right.
And I
That
think
feels really good,
it does.
actually.
Yeah.
And I think it was perfect.
challenging.
I think
And
and I think it was perfect that line was said after love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I mean, of all the time to bring that
Yeah.
in, it's like do this and then be perfect therefore. It's kind of like as you do this is sort of becoming the fullness of adulting,
Yeah.
of maturing
Yeah.
in this, because this is big. This is
Yeah.
no easy small task.
Let's just use less hashtags.
yeah.
Yeah.
That adulting hashtag.
Right.
Anyways, that's
Exactly.
a whole other episode.
Yeah, it's good.
Let's leave it there. That's awesome. Really good conversation. Over to you as you continue to talk about this, dig in together. Thanks for hanging out with us. We'll catch you next time. Peace.